So it's been absolutely crazy today with game news, specifically from Microsoft, because they are just having a massive blowout around the Xbox Series X and the Series S. We're going to go over a lot of that information tomorrow morning in Newswave, but today I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the inside of the Series S, because we did this with the Series X when Microsoft kind of showed it off a little bit in a video, but they've done the same thing here with the Series S. And for a lot of people, because this is the cheaper alternative, the $300 system, a lot of people are curious how it's put together exactly, how they would have saved some of that money. And I'm going to tell you about some of it here, because I do think this system, after looking over the exploded view that Microsoft put out, is actually a fairly well-built system, and it's very minimalistic, but it's also very efficient inside. So we're going to be going over all of that here today, guys. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit the like button down below. It does help out a lot. And if you're brand new here to the SpawnWave Plus channel, make sure you subscribe down below, because there's going to be a lot of next-gen news coming up. Sony should be up pretty soon, and they've also already promised a teardown of the PS5 ahead of time, and I'm excited to kind of go over that here as well with you guys, so we can take a look at what is one of the most interesting looking systems right now, the PlayStation 5. So let's go over here to the Xbox Series S. This is our exploded view of it. We can see at the top, we have our plastics here with the nice black speaker grill. And then at the bottom here, we have our bottom plastic. And then right in the middle here, we have our motherboard. And right away, I like that Microsoft is going with kind of these black motherboards compared to the green motherboards that are in the Xbox One X, for example. I think these look a lot sharper. I know it's not something that people are really going to see because you have to take the system apart to get to it. I just like the look of it overall. I think it's a cool look for the motherboard itself. Now, going from there, we have our metal chassis that the system will sit in. It will also be using some of that chassis to cool chips, technically passively, but it will also be leveraging the larger fan in here. And we also have there's our fan, there's our power supply, there's the heatsink that sits below the fan, and then our main chip here. And let's actually go over to that chip itself. All right, so looking at this chip, it is it's hard to tell the size compared to the Series X chip. I assume it's smaller, right? Because the CPU is the same as what's in the Series X, according to Microsoft, but the GPU side is cut in half, basically. So it's going to be a weaker system in terms of resolutions, but for everything else that has to be done using the CPU, it's going to run basically the same as the Series X, which is kind of mind-blowing for its pricing. Looking around the system here with the chip, we have 4 RAM modules. Now, we know the system has 10 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory, okay? And hearing GDDR6 in a $300 system like this is, it's hard to believe, right? But it seems that Microsoft went with slower RAM for the 8 gigabytes that should be around the chip here. And then they went even slower with 2 gigabytes that seem to be reserved for OS operations. Now, they sent over a spec sheet for both systems here, and I looked down it, and the Series S has 8 gigabytes at 224 gigabytes per second, which I would assume we have 2, 4, 6, 8. So we have 4 RAM modules here that are as close as it can get pretty much to the main chip itself. I would assume these are the faster RAM chips, which will be used for visuals and graphics and all that stuff. For the OS side, we have 2 gigabytes at 56 gigabytes per second. Now, has a fairly large difference in speed between them, right? So the main chips here are technically faster than what's on the PlayStation 4 Pro, but that 2 gigabytes at 56 gigabytes per second is slower than what's in the original VCR Xbox One. And that's a little strange, but if it's mostly just being used for OS level operations and apps and stuff, it really won't make that much of a difference, to be honest. And of course, according to Microsoft, they can also leverage the SSD for certain things as well. So I think it should work fine in practice. Now, I was trying to figure out where the other chip would be, because if we have, we'll just say 2 gigabyte RAM modules, we're short 2 gigabytes. I think they stored the other one underneath, and that's why we have this piece right here. I would say it's probably just on the other side of here. So we can actually see it would be right about here. Maybe just honestly right on the other side of this RAM chip underneath. And that would probably be the slower 2 gigabyte RAM chip. It makes sense, and that's a good way for them to save money, opt for slower RAM because this system wouldn't really need it. Doing like 1440p and 1080p, it doesn't make sense to have stupidly fast RAM for a system that wouldn't even really use it. Now let's talk about how Microsoft is going to cool this chip and basically the rest of the system, because it's going to have one larger fan on top of a heatsink that would then sit on top of this chip and would probably also cool kind of these RAM chips around it as well. There'll probably be thermal pads and maybe an extra plate or something going around it, but they are going to use a heatsink that is very similar in look to what's on the Xbox One original system, and the Xbox One S doesn't appear to have the fancier heatsink that the Xbox One X has, mostly because I don't know if this chip would really need it. Sure, it's going to have a Zen 2 CPU in it and all of that, but I think it's just in general going to use less power. Like I said, the GPU is basically cut in half, so we'll see what power draw is, but I have a feeling this fan should be perfectly fine cooling it. And keep in mind, this fan is also going to cool other components in this system, like our power supply, because we're going to have basically the fan and heatsink sit on top. The power supply will sit next to it. And you can even see if we zoom into the power supply, it has airflow going across with an arrow, because what will happen is this fan will pull air up and out, and because it's doing that, it will create a suction effect, pulling air in from the side. So, for example, we have a lot of vents on this side, right? I mean, there's basically one big vent from what I can tell. Some of these might be fake holes, kind of, but it seems to match up with our power supply here that is vented completely. So air will come in, pull across this power supply, pull across any other components on this board, such as the south bridge right here, this big silver chip, and then exit out of the top through the big heatsink. Now, keep in mind, the only moving part in this system is this fan. So the overall, I guess, noise level that this system makes is completely dependent on this one fan right here. So if it manages to stay fairly quiet, the system will be very quiet, which is good because the Xbox One X, for the most part, stays pretty quiet. I've heard it get kind of loud at times, but that was using a different method of cooling, where it was using a push method, where it's pushing air through the heatsink. This will be pulling air out. And from what we've seen, the times that Microsoft has used this with the Xbox One S and the Xbox One original VCR, they've stayed pretty quiet. So I feel like this system itself won't be very loud, and it will work very well in, say, a bedroom where you don't want a super loud system to be, right? This, I think, is going to work out pretty well in the noise level department. Now, we do have some of our I/O ports on the back here. They didn't even bother to fill them in. They just show us what it looks like when it comes off of like, I guess, the factory conveyor belt when they haven't put them in yet. But we can kind of go down here and make a best guess on some of these. It's pretty obvious, I think. Like, for example, this should be our external storage, or our the spot where you would put your memory card into, the one that Seagate is creating. That's most likely where that would go. It's kind of strange, unique, and it would probably match up pretty well based on the size and the shape. Next to that should be our HDMI port. You can tell because HDMI ports in the Xbox One X and the PlayStation 4 generally have surface-mounted pins right here. And when you desolder them, you have to be very careful not to lift any of those. Trust me, when I see this, all I think of is HDMI port in the PlayStation 4 because they broke all the time. Above that, we have USB port, and then this should be our Ethernet port right here. Unfortunately, I can't see much else above that. I don't know if there really are any other ports. I don't know if they're missing anything necessarily. There won't be a Connect port, so I guess not. The front, obviously, our other USB port, which matches up perfectly with these two. And we have a slot here for our faceplate. Well, the faceplate power board is what I would call it, where it'll plug in and it'll let us press the sync button and, of course, turn it on. Looks like this matches up as well. So maybe they're doing two different boards now that I'm looking at it. Or maybe they will just have one going all the way across, because this would be where our power button is up here. And then down here is where we would have our sync button. Now, I'm a little disappointed we don't get to see the other side, because I feel like that is where the SSD would be. It's probably on the opposite side where the south bridge is, and we saw that with the Xbox Series X, where it was on the opposite side of where our main APU chip is. It was on the opposite side. And looking at this underneath where we have our metal chassis, it's probably going to leverage either this square right here, this rectangle, or this square up here and use this screw to help push it against it with a thermal pad. It could just be honestly a cluster of just overall flash chips and then like a controller, so it won't even look that different from like RAM chips or something. I don't think they're going to get too fancy with that on a $300 system. But most likely it's on the opposite side, and it would just use the chassis and then, of course, our fan that's going to be pulling air in completely and over everything to cool it. But I have to give Microsoft some credit here. This seems to be a well put together system. The only points of failure that I can see, the obvious one being the fan. It's the most exposed. If something gets spilled into the speaker grill, for example, with kids or something, that would be a problem. But it's completely modular. It would pop out. You'd plug a new one in. You would have to open it up, of course. But otherwise, there's not a lot of spots for failure. The power supply, of course, the fan, that's kind of it. There's no hard drive, mechanical hard drive anyway, in there, right? There's no disk drive, so that wouldn't fail. It's, for the most part, a pretty straightforward system. It's minimalistic and it's efficient from what I can tell. But the big question I have now is how loud is that fan? Because we could be dealing with a near silent system if that fan is able to keep up with it. But let me know what you guys think about the design here. We're still going to pick it up and take it apart and all that because I want to see what the overall teardown process is, because there's obviously no screws or anything here to really go by. I will say there's not a lot of screw holes in general on this system, so it might even be a fairly easy system to take apart unless there's a lot of clips, in which case that will be a pain. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.